So, welcome to the 5th Casalegno lecture. As usual, you do the lecture first, and then we have the discussion.
Thank you, Elisa. So we have air conditioning today. That was, hope everyone will be more comfortable. Okay, I'm going to start today with some general remarks about dispositional properties and their relation to conditionals and to the projection strategy that I talked about on Wednesday, sort of really expanding on one of the examples of the idea of the projection strategy, namely the Goodman's way of thinking about dispositional predicates. Then, after sort of looking in a little bit more detail at the general issue, I go back to the game and decision theory models that I talked a little bit about, sketched really. I didn't really define the models, but it sets the idea of a kind of model of a game, a model of a sequence of decisions. And in this context, see a little bit more specific reflection of some of the general issues, particularly the idea of the game theoretic notion of a strategy and a way of thinking of a strategy as a complex dispositional property. And the general hope is, I was saying, I don't have a big, constructive, uniform picture to offer in defense of a way of thinking metaphysically about natural necessity, so much as a family of strategies for trying to get clearer about some of the connections between some of these different notions. And so part of my motivation here is to say there's some very specific problems about practical reasoning, and also some very specific problems in epistemology about inductive reasoning. And these specific issues, it helps to illuminate them, to connect them together with some more abstract metaphysical issues concerning the nature of natural necessity. So we'll see something about how going back and forth between these kinds of formal models one gets of different kinds and trying to see how they can be put together, one can at least bring out some we hope some illumination, but in some cases just a matter of articulating and clarifying where the problems are. Okay, so dispositions and conditionals. A dispositional property generally is a property that's understood in terms of the way it manifests itself under certain conditions. So the disposition of an object is directly, closely related to two other properties. So you think of a dispositional property as a monadic property of something, the thing that has the dispositional property. And the two other properties are a manifestation condition and a test condition. However, one analyzes the relationship between these three properties, whether one of them can be analyzed in terms of the others and so on, whatever one thinks about that, everyone sort of thinks of the nature of dispositions as being characterized in terms of these three kinds of properties. So a glass is fragile if it would shatter if dropped, roughly speaking. It would tend to shatter if dropped. It would bend if it's flexible. Then, if it were subjected to suitable pressure, it would bend. it's soluble in water if it would dissolve if put in water. It's observable if it can be seen by a suitable observer under suitable lighting conditions. These are very, in most cases, somewhat vague characterizations of a property. What are suitable conditions and so on, but one generally understands dispositions in terms of things that manifest themselves under certain specific conditions. The examples I give are very different, both in how vague or specific they are, and also how much they're just sort of common sense characterizations of a fairly superficial kind of property, or whether they're themselves theoretically loaded. So soluble is a kind of paradigm people sometimes talk about, but it's a technical, scientific notion. It's not dissolving, is not simply a superficial observable property. It's a particular kind of physical chemical process. And so the very notion of dissolving and solubility are connected to a theory. But many of the others, you begin with a kind of rough characterization of the way a thing behaves, and that's a kind of primitive start on getting kind of theoretical understanding of a process that's going on. In the old philosophy of science literature from the logical empiricist days in the 30s and 40s, dispositions were regarded as the simplest kind of theoretical term. The general problem was, how do we explain unobservable entities and theoretical concepts in terms of observation? Observable properties and observable concepts. So the idea is that manifestation conditions are observable properties, although as we'll see, that's not always the case in the more abstract consideration. But since one can't just sort of look at a thing and tell that it's fragile, unless one has a theoretical understanding of what kinds of things are fragile. But it's a fairly superficial problem, or a property nonetheless. So the idea was that if we have difficulty even in explaining dispositional properties in terms of observation, then how are we going to ever understand more highly theoretical notions? So the starting point, in particular with Carnap, who had a theory about dispositional properties and a way of trying to give them partial analyses, this really is the origin of the problem. But the problem takes on a life of its own beyond the positivist time. Now, it was thought in this early discussion that if we could only understand counterfactuals, then we could define dispositional properties in terms of counterfactuals, simply by saying that the property of being flexible was simply to be defined as the counterfactual property of being such that if it were subjected to suitable pressure, it would bend. So, I mean, that's one of the motivations that Goodman had for looking for an analysis of counterfactuals. But it was taken for granted that, well, if we could do that, that would solve this problem. But then we can't find an analysis of counterfactuals, Goodman argued. So the simple pattern, as I said, of analysis would be, of dispositions in terms of counterfactuals would be, if it passes the test condition, if it had passed the test condition, it would pass the manifestation condition, something that would be counterfactual in some contexts and not counterfactual in others. So an object is flexible if only it would be subjected to suitable, would bend if subjected to suitable pressure. But then it was argued in a classic paper which was very influential, by C.B. Martin, that this simple analysis of dispositions in terms of counterfactual won't work anyway. And this led to an extensive literature about what came to be called Finkish dispositions. So Martin's example, a contrived example, but there are other situations that might be less obvious but more natural of this kind of thing, was what he called an Electoral Fink. So an Electoral Fink is a device that connects to, when it detects a live wire, that a live wire is about to be touched by a conductor, then under that condition, instantly it causes the wire to become dead. So you have a live wire, you connect an electrofink to it, and it's kind of a protective device, so that if ever a conductor were to come close to the live wire, it would immediately shut the electricity off. So the property of being live with respect to an electrical wire is a dispositional property where the test condition is being touched by a conductor and the manifestation condition is current flowing from the wire to the conductor. The live wire remains live when connected to the electrofink, but it no longer has the counterfactual property. So the idea is it retains its dispositional property. You don't change anything about the property of the wire. It's still a live wire. There's still electricity in it. But it doesn't have the property of being such that current would flow from the wire if touched by the conductor, because being touched by the conductor would have, by the time the conductor got there, have turned off the current because of the electrofink. The potential gap between counterfactual predicates and dispositional predicates was anticipated in a less, in a simpler, straightforward way by Goodman, who gave a simple example of an object which is inflammable, even though it would not burn if heated. And the reason it would not burn if heated is because it's in an oxygen-free environment. The general lesson that Goodman drew was that, as he put it, quote, to speak very loosely, the dispositional statement says something exclusively about the internal state of W, the object, while our original counterfactual, if it were heated, it would burn, is a more general property about the overall situation. So the idea is a counterfactual makes a claim about an overall situation, whereas a disposition is supposed to make a claim about a specific, normally, not always, but an intrinsic property of the object. Okay, so while the original counterfactual says something additional about the surrounding circumstances. So it was in this context that, making this point, that Goodman remark I noted on Wednesday, that the problem of dispositions is perhaps the problem of dispositions is really simpler than the problem of counterfactuals, and that we should perhaps approach the former problem first. But this way of approaching Goodman's way of approaching the problem of dispositions was not, as he attempted to do with counterfactuals, to look to a reductive analysis in general of dispositions in terms of the test condition and the manifestation condition, but rather to instead to link this kind of conceptual problem, the problem of explaining these concepts that go beyond observable concepts, by linking them to the problem of induction, to the methods we used, as I said last time. We talked about that you have the problem of inferring, the problem of induction put in a very simple-minded way, but the problem of inferring from observation to things not yet observed, analogous to the problem of inferring conceptually, extending a property from things that are subject to a test condition to things that aren't subject, perhaps not subject to the test condition. So it's basically the idea of trying to say, well, we got the problem of induction anyway, and all of the various ways of thinking about our inductive reasoning, and even though we can't solve the problem of induction on Hume's terms, what we can do is give a kind of account of what we're doing when we do induction, and the descriptive procedures we find by solving this very general problem of epistemology can be applied to understanding how we project conceptually to get dispositions. So that was the idea, and that's the projection strategy. So the picture, to quote from Goodman, the way he thought of it, this is a quotation in the middle of the first, toward the end of the first page of the handout. Flexes and fails to flex are mutually exclusive, and together they exhaust the realm of things that are under suitable pressure. But neither applies to anything, neither flexes nor fails to flex, applies to anything that is outside of this realm. If it's not subject to suitable pressure, it doesn't fail to flex, whatever it is. So thus, from the fact that flexes does not apply to a thing that we cannot in general infer that fails to flex does apply. Within the realm of things under suitable pressure, however, the two predicates not only affect a dichotomy, but coincide exactly with flexible and inflexible. Again, idealizing a bit with odd cases where things behave in abnormal ways. So when the dispositional predicate, what the dispositional predicate does, again, still quoting Goodman, is, so to speak, to project this dichotomy to a wider class of things. And a predicate like flexible may thus be regarded as an expansion or projection of the predicate flexes. So that's the picture. What is the basis for this projection or extension of the application of the predicate to the wider domain? Can one, and the idea is one uses exactly the same principles that one uses to make predictions about the future, or more generally, from the unobserved to the unobserved. So again, no analysis here, just saying we have some general methods of solving a certain problem, and we can extend those methods to a different problem. So again, as we did, we contrasted the projection strategy with the reduction strategy that guided Goodman's original project, and that also guided David Lewis's approach to counterfactuals that we talked about. Dispositional predicates are taken as primitive, and Goodman would have insisted we don't have partial definitions, even though in a sense there is a kind of partial definition here. We have to take those as postulates and introduce just new primitives, but justify the introduction of those primitives by the way we use inductive procedure to tell that they are present. So the project is to explain how we can have evidence about their exemplifications, that is, about the presence of a dispositional property. They are like the objective properties that De Finetti explained, although De Finetti didn't believe in such properties, but he provided the resources for applying the projection strategy to the concept of objective chance. You can't observe objective chance, but the conceptual connection between chance and subjective probability that's brought out by De Finetti's mathematical result explains how one can have evidence based on observation, namely on the actual flips of the coin, whether they come up heads or tails on particular flips, how those can be seen as a kind of manifestation of the disposition, which gives you not certainty, but probability of in a very precise way, the hypothesis that some chance property is present, that the coin has a bias of 2/3, can be confirmed to as high a degree as you like as you gather more and more evidence. And that's sort of a corollary of the theorem that he proves, that you will get confirmation of these empirical hypotheses about dispositional properties. So then if we can vindicate dispositional properties in this way, then they'll be available as a resource for characterizing the relevant notion of comparative similarity or minimal difference that will give us a substantial account of counterfactual dependence. But they also rely on an implicit hypothesis about independence. So that's why they're not reductive. So it's essential that, the idea of a disposition is that the test condition, whether the thing is put under pressure or not, that's a sort of local property that an object has at a certain moment, and that having that property or not is under normal conditions counterfactually independent or causally independent of whether the disposition is there. So that's why the Finkish idea is an idea we can artificially introduce a counterexample to the independence, but the independence is still playing a central role in the theory, because the reason it has the disposition is that normally you don't take dispositions away when you put something under the counterfactual conditions. Now, Goodman was a minimalist who was happy about a skeptic about intentional notions such as properties and relations. But he was happy enough to talk about predicates and their extensions, but not about properties. But this is a hang-up that we can separate from his projection strategy for explaining dispositions. So one who's more friendly to properties might put the point this way: we find a distinction, things shatter or they don't, that is manifested under a certain test condition when they get dropped. We hypothesize that there exists a property that coincides with the display property normally whenever the test condition is met, but that things have or lack independently of whether they satisfy the test condition. The test and manifestation conditions are then used to fix the reference of the hypothesized property. So it's the property, if there is one, which explains why things shatter when they break. Now, the hypothesis is an empirical one, as reference-fixing stipulations always have an empirical presupposition if they're empirical. This attempt to fix the reference may fail. As we saw, we talked a little bit the other time about the alleged or hypothetical hypothesized property of being lucky that a person might have. And the idea that really the empirical hypothesis is there is some feature of the person that have independent of their engaging in chance events like buying lottery tickets, which lead them to be successful. It's like having a greater chance of winning if you're a lucky person. But the hypothesis that there is such a property is not borne out, because if the hypothesis were correct, then you can assume that you would be able to find other properties that tend to correlate with it empirically. So then that would give rise to further ways of establishing that the property is present. And it would lead to sort of theoretical building on the hypothesis that the property exists or is instantiated. When you try that, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it leads theory, but it's not. There's no algorithm for telling when it works. It's a matter of making empirical hypotheses, drawing, putting them together with other theoretical hypotheses that you are inclined to accept, and drawing conclusions from them, and either getting things confirmed or disconfirmed. So a very general way of thinking about the intuitive picture here is something like this. If we look at just the surface of things, just try to be extremely descriptive about what you see in the world without any theoretical assumptions at all, what you will find is a seemingly chaotic sequence of events as things interact with each other. The theorist hypothesizes that the things that are interacting have certain underlying, more stable, persisting properties, even though everything keeps changing in the world as we look at things. And that there are certain properties, perhaps underlying and unobservable properties, which persist through this and help to explain why the interactions, chaotic interactions, are as they are. So there are properties that are more stable and independent than the overt behavior of the interacting things would suggest. When two or more things interact, the behavior that's manifested will depend on the underlying dispositional properties of all of the things. And the test conditions for the dispositions of one thing might make reference to the dispositional properties of other things, in particular with the things they interact with. So to use a familiar kind of example, a key is disposed to open a certain kind of lock. What kind of lock? The kind that is disposed to open when by that key. Now this particular description of the dispositions is entirely circular, but it nevertheless is correct in terms of identifying a feature of the lock which it has independently of the existence of the key, although of course, since it's an artifact, it was designed to fit the key, but the actual physical base of the disposition is something the lock has independently of the properties that the key had. It's because of the relationships between the two more stable disposition properties that they tend to interact as they do. Now it's obvious there's no analysis here, but there is a non-trivial hypothesis that helps to define the explanatory project of determining the character of the relevant properties of the separate components of some system. So any kind of sort of theoretical approach to understanding how some complex system works will involve separating the parts and saying what is it about this part and this part that makes them work together in the way they do. Now dispositions come and go. While manifest conditions are extremely local, dispositional properties aren't something that something has forever or essentially, or they needn't be. A thing may be disposed to acquire or lose a disposition. So we get a kind of hierarchy here, a potential hierarchy of more complex dispositions which when they have a disposition, they're disposed to get another one or something like that. So the manifestation condition for one disposition might be the acquisition of another disposition. So I once saw a very neat experiment, demonstration of some properties of super cold objects. You put a banana in a liquid nitrogen thing and super cool it, and took it out and dropped it on the floor. It shattered like a glass. Okay, so a banana normally is not fragile, but it is disposed to become fragile and therefore disposed to shatter when dropped if it's supercooled. An ice sculpture is disposed to shatter when dropped, so it's fragile, but it's also disposed to melt more slowly when heated, and when it's heated, it loses its fragility as well as its shape and various other properties which are not far from being dispositional properties themselves. The finkishness of dispositions in a certain contrived situation, that is the phenomenon that demonstrates the inadequacy of the simple conditional analysis, is just one kind of example of the complex interaction of dispositional properties. So the general pattern of a finkish disposition is something like this. Property D1 is the property of being disposed to manifest property M in condition T. That's the disposition of being a live wire. D2, a second dispositional property, is the property of being disposed to lose D1 under the same test condition, the condition of being, or at least the imminence of the test condition comes a little bit before. So D1 is a finkish disposition. This is the more abstract characterization. D1 is a finkish disposition of an object that is if it also has a dispositional property D2, the property to be disposed to lose the first disposition. In the standard examples, the D2, as in the Fink C.B. Martin's example, D2 is an extrinsic property, not an intrinsic property. It's something outside that's detached to the live wire, but it could be a separate but still intrinsic dispositional property. Finkishness, along with other patterns of interaction, there are lots of examples in the dispositional literature of different kinds of masking properties and antidote properties for dispositions like being poisonous and so on. These other patterns show that the stability and independence conditions that the dispositional hypotheses are aiming at is relative and defeasible. So you can lose the independence if you're put in a certain kind of situation. When a disposition D1 is finkish, then the test condition and the property are not because of the Fink, independent. But the notion of counterfactual independence still plays an essential role in the characterization of dispositions. It's essential to an example of a finkish disposition that the two dispositional properties, the D1 and the D2, the disposition to do it and the disposition to take away the first disposition, are independent of each other, at least in the sense that it makes sense to suppose counterfactually that the thing has the one property but not the other. If you try to construct an example of a finkish disposition where the two D1 and D2, the two dispositions, are realized in the same underlying property, then it won't work. You won't be able to find it. Now, okay, so that's the general remarks about disposition, about the strategy of trying to develop a particular theory for a particular context in which you talk about dispositional properties. And so now I want to look at the kinds of a special condition, namely a particular kind of application where one might carry on this kind of explanation of what the dispositions are. And that's the kind of structure that represents a decision situation. So you can see a game is a representation of a complex interaction. The game might involve some chance moves. It might be that you flip coins or you deal cards at certain stages where the chances of the various hands that you get in the cards are what known and specified in defining the game. And then the players get their hands or whatever they get, and they then make various moves in sequence responding to each other's actions. So you have an interactive process, which is, again, what the game theory provides is a very highly idealized representation of this interactive structure. In trying to articulate that structure and to explain the causal interaction, one way to do it is to introduce various dispositional properties which will be manifested when the time for action occurs. So an agent or a bunch of a class of agents, finite set of agents in a game, each have various dispositional properties. And the dispositional properties they have will be of several different kinds. And one of the things I want to do is look at in the final part is to look at the relationship between different kinds of dispositional properties of an agent that go into explaining why the agent does what he or she does. So in characterizing a decision problem, you give degrees of beliefs and credences, numerical or measurable propositional attitudes, both of quantized versions of belief and quantized versions of desire or valuing, motivational states. Probability represented in the formal theory by probabilities and utilities, and those should be thought of as dispositional properties. When we move from the extensive form of a game represented by the tree structure that shows in time the interaction of agents, to the more abstract but simpler strategic form of the game, we are moving to a more to a more extensive dispositional account of the relevant features of the game, the people and the chance moves that get made. So the idea of the strategic form intuitively is that the way in the idealization, the way that everybody is disposed to behave at the beginning of the game will determine what they do as the game proceeds. That is, they have dispositional properties at the beginning, and those are successively manifested or not. Some of them are not manifested, but when the circumstances arise, that will have an effect on altering the dispositions, in that when you learn new things, you believe new things. Your credences change in the course of a game, but the idealized theory assumes that the way your beliefs change in the course of a game are determined by your dispositions to change your beliefs in certain ways, namely by conditionalization, at least in the case where the thing you learn is compatible with what you previously assigned probability 1 to. So you have a kind of assumption of conditionalization, which is a hypothesis about how attitudes for a rational agent, for a fully rational agent, change in the course of a situation where one of the events that happens is the requiring of evidence. Games make highly constraining assumptions, which, in the original game theory, which once you get on account of the kind of models of games we have, and once we've introduced beliefs, structures, and probabilities into game theory, it allows for further generalization. In the game theory as it is, in all the standard games, it's assumed that utilities stay the same throughout the game. The utilities come at the end. So the utilities are you play your game and then you get a payoff at the end. But realistically, you can have a situation where the values that you have may change in the course of a game. And if one had some kind of systematic theory of how they change, then you could introduce that. And the fact is that in Bayesian decision theory does give us a systematic, mathematical, precise theory of how rational belief changes as one receives evidence, but we don't have any theory about how values change. So the assumption is the values remain the same. And there are various artificial ways of trying to introduce changes of utilities, but you could do it more directly. And I think this actually, if one actually looks at some of the potential applications of game theory, ways in which beliefs change will be very important for strategic reasoning. If you think in general, what goes on in a negotiation, in a strategic interaction, in a discussion, or even just the interaction between people walking down the street. I mean, there's a tendency, this is a purely empirical speculation, but it seems there's a tendency for you to think of the people you're interacting with as friends or foes. That is, a game where there's lots of common interest is got a certain stability to it, and where there's a certain pure conflict of interest, the game has a certain stability to it. And we tend to gravitate toward those things. So as you interact, if you are my friend, if you cooperate, you help me, then I have a tendency to reciprocate. Now, part of the reciprocation in games is familiar and explainable in the resources of the theory, because there's tit-for-tat kind of strategies where I may punish you in the future because you punished me in the past. And so there can be a purely strategic reason for changing for cooperating in a situation with which a person with which you have conflict. But it also can happen that I am less inclined to take your values seriously as things that I should respect if I regard you as my enemy, right? And if you cross me, and people want revenge, they want to hurt someone for its own sake, because I tend to go to a more sum-zero kind of way of thinking. So there's psychological reasons which might be partly explained by the dynamics of valuation, which go beyond the simple strategic form of reasoning. But in any case, the idea is one has an interaction here and one wants to explain the interaction in terms of the dispositional properties, allowing for the fact that dispositional properties themselves are subject to change, because there are dispositions to acquire and change dispositions in systematic ways. Before getting to looking at the game, the idea of a strategy, I wanted to introduce one further structural property of dispositions related to Finkishness, which will come up. So here's a kind of property of feature of a complex dispositional situation. Imagine that we have a electrical system with a fuse, and in addition, a backup fuse. The first fuse is disposed to break the circuit, as fuses do, when the circuit is overloaded. So the test condition is overloaded circuit, too much current. The manifest condition is breaking the circuit. The second fuse, the backup fuse, is disposed to break the circuit if it's overloaded and the first fuse fails. So imagine two fuses wired in series where the second fuse will never be broken, assuming the first one works. But still, these are separate things, so one can understand this complex structure even though the whole system is set up so the second dispositional property is never manifested because the test condition is never met. But since everything is defeasible, you could imagine it could happen that the first one would fail. A second example of this kind of structure, consider a slow-acting vaccine that's disposed to protect the patient. This is a very ineffective vaccine. Protect the patient against the fast-acting killer virus. The virus is disposed to kill the patient before the vaccine takes effect. But the vaccine is disposed to prevent the patient from dying on the assumption that the virus doesn't kill the patient right away. So we have, again, two dispositional properties, one of which is manifested only if the other one fails. Okay. Again, it's essential to the existence of this kind of pattern that these two properties be in some way independent of each other, in that one can understand what it would be for the thing to have the one but not the other, or for the one to work and the other one not to. Okay, now the games I talked about last time were interactive sequences, and we make the move to the strategic form, represented by a matrix, which represents the situation as understood before the game starts. And the idea is that if the game were to be played out in real time with the actual interaction, assuming the agents are perfectly rational and will change their behavior in the way in which the disposition suggests, the rational disposition suggests they will, then the outcome of a rational choice in the strategy situation will be the same as the situation would be if the game were played out. So we represent the dispositional properties of the players at the start of the game. And you can think of them as dispositions which actually are manifested, not in the playing of the game by handing the referee the strategies, but rather by actually just playing it out in real time. Now, in our models of the game, the types of the player, that is, we define the dispositional properties of the player with their types by saying what their prior beliefs are, and perhaps also what their dispositional or what their belief revision policies are, which are again another kind of disposition which extends conditionalization. So you can say, suppose you learned something which in fact has probability 0 for you. Suppose you were to learn, you assign probability 0 to some proposition. That is, you say, I'm certain that my opponent will not choose option L. And then it turns out my opponent does choose option L, to my surprise, and I learn it. So now I have to revise my beliefs, and I can't conditionalize because I assign probability 0 to this. But I can have belief revision policies, perhaps represented by a lexicographic, more extended probability system. I can have properties, belief revision properties, which tell me how I change my beliefs when I learn this surprising information. Okay, so the beliefs and desires are, and the belief revision policies are a certain kind of mental disposition, but a strategy is a different kind of dispositional property. So a strategy is thought of as a kind of conditional intention. So strategies are not identified with something that has to do with utility. Utilities and probabilities motivate you to choose a strategy. They motivate you to make a plan, a contingency plan, perhaps, to do certain things under certain conditions. But simply having a desire, even, that is, for something to have much higher expected utility than something else, is not itself, by definition, it isn't a decision to do that other thing. So the idea of decision theory is that an action, while it's motivated and perhaps even determined by your probabilities and utilities, if you're rational, it's itself something conceptually independent of this. So there are two very different kinds of dispositional properties that play a role in a unfolding decision theoretic situation. You have the things that make your decisions rational or not, namely, according to the theory, namely the values that you're trying to achieve, and then there are the decisions which either are rational or not. But it's essential to the game situation that you have the capacity to do any of the things, to perform any of the actions that are available, to follow any of the branches from the choice point that you reach. So a strategy is a complex intention. It represents conditional intention. What will you do if this choice point is reached? What will you do if that choice point is reached? And so on. So to have a strategy is to be disposed to act in those ways. Now, even if there's a very clear distinction between what you want and what you do at the moment of choice. So you say, I'm deliberating, and I figure out that the rational thing to do is to choose option L rather than R, and then I say, therefore I do it. And that's a further move. But forming an intention which brings with it a belief, that is if you intend to do something, then you believe that you will do it. And yet, you can form an intention, and that is not a decision. That's not doing it. right? That's only because maybe it's in the future that you will execute your intention. So an intention falls somewhere between a kind of property that you find yourself with. I mean, you say beliefs and attitude are in some way kind of passive. They're there. I notice that I have these beliefs and values. But actions are things you do, and there's an epistemological connection which is central here, which is that in the case of intention and decision, you know what you do in virtue of deciding to do it. So I don't have evidence. If I say, I'm looking at the thing and say, am I going to have a ham sandwich or a salad at lunch, and I know that I'm going to have the ham sandwich because that's what I've decided to do, right? And I don't have evidence that that's what I'm going to do. I have a decision. So it's sort of very emphasized by philosophers like Elizabeth Anscombe and Stuart Hampshire and David Velleman later and others, that a distinction between knowledge by decision and knowledge by discovery. Both play an epistemological role, but forming a plan about what to do in the future is decision-like, but defeasible in that it's subject to execution when the time comes. And so there's special properties of that. But a strategy is a kind of conditional intention. Okay, so I wanted to make just a connection between the notion of a strategy and one of these complex properties that arise in the interaction of dispositions. And this is on the. Before we get to that, let me just say. If you have a notion of strategy, you can define, or you have a model for a game. You can define rationality in several different ways. Some more stronger, some stronger than one stronger than the other. You can define a player's play in the game as being rational if every action they take is rational. So you can first of all define the rationality of an action. It maximizes expected utility. The property of a whole game, a player in a game, is rational if every choice the player makes is rational. But a stronger notion, that's sort of what Robert Aumann called material rationality. Substantive rationality is the property not only is every choice you make rational, but every choice you would make would be rational, every counterfactual choice. So you can imagine a situation where somebody's drunk at the party and I take their car keys away so that they can't drive home. This person is such that they would have, being no longer fully rational, they would have driven home drunk if they had had their car keys. But I perform a preliminary action in the game, namely taking the car keys away, removing the option that the other player has of driving home. So it turned out the other player was rational in the material sense. Everything they did was rational, but they weren't substantively rational because they would have done something irrational if they had had the chance. So you might think of this person as having a strategy, which was drive home if I can, a conditional intention to drive home if I can. That occasion didn't arise. That node of the tree wasn't reached. So therefore, the person was prevented from acting irrationally, but not thereby from being irrational in the stronger sense. Okay, now, in that light, we can make a distinction between two things that might explain why you don't reach a certain node of the tree. So it might be that you don't reach it because the other players don't make the moves which would take you there. So I say, I don't know for sure whether I'm going to get to this point, because I don't know whether earlier moves in the game will allow me to make a certain choice. But you also can be in a situation where I know by decision that I am not going to reach a certain node of the tree. So that, just to illustrate the example, and this is the one bit of graphics that I managed to get into the handout. We have two moves. This is just to illustrate the point. Think of this as a one-player game. And this is the utilities that are achieved. By each move. Okay, now there are, in this game, 4 strategies. There's the strategy, choose L1 from this node, and choose L2 from that one. There's a strategy L1, R2, R1, L2, R1, R2. The first 2 strategies I mentioned are purely counterfactual strategies. They are strategies that say, choose this, in which case you yourself know by decision you're not going to reach this point. But a full strategy still has to answer the question, what would you do if you did reach that point? So one distinguishes a full strategy of this kind from a plan. A plan is like, there are only 3 plans. Choose L1, that's the end, or choose R1, L2, or choose R1, R2. So a plan is a sort of truncated strategy that eliminates the purely counterfactual ones, the things you know by decision you're not going to do. So the idea of deciding what to do if you don't do what you're going to decide is what you need to do to have a full strategy. So the observation is that this has the pattern of the backup fuse. Right? It has the pattern that here you have an element, a dispositional property, a dispositional conditional decision, which will be reached only if your dispositions overall are not reached. So first disposition to choose L1, second disposition to choose R2 if you reach this point. So I might ask, what point would there be in having full strategies rather than simply plans? And it's connected with the issue with the dispositional property. You have these kind of patterns of disposition only if the things are somewhat independent of each other. If you want to reduce rationality to the rationality of individual actions, then you need to think about strategies. So if one asks, suppose the agent chose L1, was that a rational choice? And the answer might be, well, that depends on what the person would do if they had chosen R1. Because the person who chooses L1 over R1 is saying, what's the expected utility of this, and what's the expected utility of that? And in order to determine the expected utility of that, you have to answer what's the expected utility, what's the probability of this different choice. So you say, suppose the agent says, the reason I chose L1 is because if I had chosen R1, I would have chosen L2. So I got 1 rather than 0. And I say, why would you have chosen L2? I say, well, that would have been irrational. But that doesn't make this action rational. It makes only this action rational. So if you're interested in trying to explain the rationality of an agent in terms of the individual choices, then you want to talk about pure, full strategies. But a more straight, sort of natural way of thinking about it is to say what you're doing at a point like this is making a choice of a plan. And a plan is rational because you can now decide what you would do at this point. You don't have to just predict what you're going to do at this point. You can decide. So if you're at this point and you're deciding that you're going to choose this, then you're making an irrational judgment at that point. So you can say there are three plans, this, and that. This is the best one, this is the second best one, and this is the third best one. But therefore, it would be irrational to choose this one rather than that one. So there are examples in the philosophical literature about cases where, there's the famous example of the procrastinating professor who was asked to review a book, and the best choice is to accept and then review it. The second best choice is to decline, and the third worst choice is to accept the review and never do it. And the professor says, well, I'm really never going to do it. So the rational thing to do is to reject, to decline the review, and saying, well, I would be irrational or morally weak or something if I made this other choice. So there's a rationality involved somewhere, but not this choice. This choice is the right one to make. So those are the kinds of situations. So there's just a general point. There's a connection here then between, first of all, whether you should think of yourself and your future and your planning as an agent deciding not just what to do now, but what my overall situation is. Or should you think of your future self as another agent, as something subject to prediction? Realistically, you should be somewhere in between, but the game theory idealization assumes this doesn't make it accurate, but it also doesn't make it a wrong kind of idealization too, because it helps to bring out the issue of the role of this distinction between decision and prediction. It's clear enough in this case that if this were a second agent where we have a common interest and the other agent also is going to get 2 this way and 0 that way, then my first decision is based on a prediction about the other agent. I think the other agent will act irrationally, therefore the rational thing for me to do is to do that. But if it's you yourself who's the other agent, then it's not so clear how to think about the problem. Okay, well, I managed to run overtime every day now, I guess, but for that reason, maybe I'll stop. Thank you.
So,
thank you. Yeah, that's just a sort of clarification. Or so what would you say if? So it seems to me that in many more realistic cases, when you have a strategy, most of the time you lack information about some of the nodes.
Yeah,
we don't know exactly what are the payoff or what exactly is the choice. But you might have still an idea of the possible paths, right? So this is maybe it's going to be a little bit confused, but I don't know. It seems to me that then isn't in that case the evaluation of the alternative plans as partial paths, as you describe them, more useful for evaluating the overall rationality rather than to see the the whole situation as a strategy in your terminology. So, so probably the question is the following: I didn't really understand why considering plans is worse than considering the whole strategy in order to evaluate the rationality of the action. Given that given that I'm not saying considering individual plans, but comparing different plans. So I didn't get exactly the difference between the two, and in particular when there is like lack of information, it seems to me that intuitively maybe we tend to compare plans rather than look at the whole strategy. Okay, this.
Yeah, good. Okay, so again, the issue about uncertainty about the future is some of the idealizations and simplifications that the theory makes, because it's much more difficult to figure out how to theorize about without them. But in this case, it's really no reason why the game can't be, the theory can't be extended to allow for uncertainty, not just about what someone else will do in a certain situation, but doubts about what game we're playing. So what the options are. So it might be that only later will I discover that if I did something, I will have certain options later. And you can represent that one of the problems with the original version of game theory was that it didn't have probabilities except objective ones. So the way you modeled uncertainty about the game was by saying, well, let's suppose there's a chance move that starts things off that says you're playing this game or that game, and you don't know where you are in the tree because you don't know the result of the chance move. But you say, but it isn't a chance, but of course if it's a chance move, it means everybody's got to have the same beliefs about it. But it could be that neither one of us know exactly what game we're playing, and you have your reasons for not knowing, and I have mine. But a more general theory should allow for lots of uncertainty about what options you will have in the future. But there are two kinds. The kind of uncertainty that's much more difficult to model is where I don't have a clear idea what the alternatives are, that it might be what's going to happen. So, but at least you could, without too much difficulty, model a theory where I know, I'm going to be in situation A or situation B or situation C. I just don't know which, something like that. And if you were in that situation, then a plan, in the technical sense of plan, would have to tell what to do in each of the possible situations that would arise. So the only sort of peculiarity of the strategy that distinguishes it from a plan is you make decisions about things that you know won't happen, and furthermore, you know they won't happen because you have decided they won't happen. So in this game, you get to choose whether you're going to have the second choice or not. And so if you say, I'm going to make the first choice so that I don't have the second choice, and then I'm going to tell you what I would do if I were at the second point. So that's okay, again, it's like the disposition which never will be manifested. You can have a situation where it's the other player who makes the second choice, and I am subjectively certain that the other player will make a certain choice, and then it turns out I'm wrong. So that's why in a game, you want to decide, you want to have a contingency plan even for cases that you're sure won't arise, so long as it's at least possible that they do arise. Because then you, just as you're disposed to change your beliefs if you're surprised, so you're disposed to behave in certain ways if you're surprised. But I don't know if I'm getting at your worry here.
Yeah, I mean, I see it better now. But I mean, probably my worry was that. So if the point is so that if you lack information, it looks like that it might be difficult to understand what is the strategy that you think more rational.
Uh-huh.
Whereas it might be easier to think, oh, there are those possible plans. I don't know exactly which one, in which situation we will find myself, but I know that I could do this sequence of action or this other,
Mm-hmm.
probably. Well, maybe I will find myself in a completely new situation, so I don't know what to do. And then, okay, if I have this set of choices, then for instance, I can rule out certain ones as not rational or not good for some other reason. And then, I mean, it seems to me that in this case, then, I mean, if so it's like that if, maybe at a certain point I realize that then there is a general strategy that I can follow. Mm-hmm. But I might not know it before, while I think that it's easier, it might be easier for me to know more or less what are the plans that I could apply. So it seems to me that I mean, when you have an idea of the possible plan, that's enough to know what would be the rational way to do. I mean, which one are rational and which aren't, even if I don't have an idea of the general strategy. Whereas I thought that you want to say that you can't really have an evaluation of the rationality if there is no general strategy. And I thought that. So I wasn't sure of that because I thought that when there is uncertainty, sometimes we don't have an idea of the strategy, but we still have an idea of what the possible plans are. So that's.
I mean, in the case of extreme uncertainty, realistically, you just got to wait and see, right? So, I mean, I say, look, here's 2 doors. You can choose which one to go in. Each one, there's this complicated game you're going to be given. I'm not going to tell you now what the game is or something like that. And a complicated sequence of moves and all. And maybe I tell you enough so that you can say, well, I think it's a little more likely that the whole scenario that plays out if I take door 1 will be better than door 2. And I say, what are you going to do then? As I haven't the faintest idea, I don't have a plan. I'll only get my plan when you tell me more at the next stage. So there certainly are games where you don't get to find out very much. Until you get to find out a little bit, but not very much until you. And of course, you can't think of all the different things. That's why the strategic form is computationally completely unrealistic for any complicated game. Is that you can't sort of lay out all the possible things that might happen, for all you know, and make a plan for each one. That's what a full strategy or a full plan would have to be. But that's why I think it's important to think of the plan not as as a kind of dispositional thing. It's what you are disposed to do. And then that's part of the problem with separating passive dispositions from active ones, is that maybe you're disposed to behave in to make certain choices, but you can't articulate it because you don't know enough about the situation to come. So I think the situation of ignorance of what choices you're going to have in the future is a complicating factor that the theory should take account of. But it sort of helps to see that the relationship between tendencies, if you think dispositions is just ways, think of yourself as an object who's disposed to behave in various ways under various conditions. You know, when your knee is tapped, it shakes. You know, I mean, think if you're just more sophisticated things like that. Say, no, that's not quite right. You want to think of deciding things in virtue of the properties you have, but still there is this kind of way in which a choice is a disposition. And I think that when the other relevant properties like beliefs in particular are very impoverished, you don't know very much, then it's much more difficult to do. But, you know, I think, so one does, and this is the whole, of course, the decision theorists and statisticians and economists generally, you know, distinguish uncertainty from risk. So where risk is a case where you really do have some kind of stable probability judgments about alternatives which are sort of laid out there. But whereas uncertainty is something that can't be represented. You don't know enough about the situation to even have degrees of belief about the alternatives. And of course that can change over time what that is, but it's much more difficult to theorize about pure uncertainty.
Yeah, thanks.
I was wondering if you could say something about the relationship between dispositional properties and possible worlds, if dispositional properties are part of possible worlds or they are independent. Thank you.
I mean, to the extent that even though you can't give a straightforward, unqualified definition of a dispositional property in terms of counterfactuals, there is a kind of default, all other things equal, counterfactual property that's used to explain the disposition. So even if the analysis can't be given as a definition, if you are subjected to the test condition, you would show the manifestation condition is involved in the understanding of the disposition. So one has to think, if you're looking at this object and wondering whether it's fragile, and you say, well, it's a nice thing, and I don't want to. I want to know whether it's fragile, but I don't want to find out by dropping it. But why? Because if I did drop it and it were fragile, then it would break, right? And I don't want it to break. I think on the face of it, even though in a formal analysis you may try to avoid using possible worlds as a analytical resource, you're still, in some sense, inevitably talking about possibilities, non-actual possibilities, when you're talking about counterfactuals. And so possible worlds are involved in that limited sense, at least. And to that extent, they're also involved then in understanding disposition. So despite taking the point given by the refutation of the counterfactual analysis of dispositions, still seems to me the whole family of natural necessity concepts involve modal notions, notions having to do I mean, one way to think of it is seeing the world, the actual world, as in a set of alternative possibilities to which it's by factual matter it's related in various different ways. So that's the general way in which I think possible worlds come into it.
There is a puzzle in semantics which is called the Imperfective Paradox. I don't know whether you're familiar with it. The puzzle is this: under which conditions can we say truthfully that someone is crossing the street? And a natural answer is someone is crossing the street if she's engaged in some activity that eventually develops into her getting across. But we know that this natural answer is mistaken, because it may be true that someone is crossing the street, although at some point in the middle of the street he gets run over by a car, and so its activity never turns into a complete event of getting across. So there it seems that an appropriate truth conditions would need to make reference to the fact that eventually the activity manifests itself as a complete event of crossing, and as an event of getting across. But the problem is to define under which conditions we should, which conditions are relevant to as conditions under which we would expect that the event turns into a complete crossing. So it seems that it's sort of related to the problem of Finkish dispositions in a sense. One of the strategies that is used to deal with imperfective paradox is to appeal to partiality, that is, to think about possible situation, not worlds, but just smaller situation, minimal situations in which the person is engaged in the crossing activity, and the bus is not part of the situation. There's the street and the agent. It seems to me that, in a sense, in the problem of Finkish disposition, at least in the version of the puzzle that you gave, there's a similar problem. We had to get rid of the Electoral Fink. And maybe one way to do it is to think that the disposition has to be manifested in situations that contain just the live wire and the conductor, and not the Electoral Fink.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know whether that makes much sense, but
yeah, good. No, I think that's. I think you're right that there's connection here, and I think. And again, I haven't thought about. I mean, I'm familiar with the general idea of that paradox, but I haven't looked at enough examples to know what to say anything about exactly where the lines seem to get drawn. But I think the idea of a normal, I mean, all over the place we have assumptions about normal courses of events and interventions in them. And those are going to play a role, particularly when you have these kind of interactions where you have two kinds of dispositional things, both of which you can say, well, this one, normally things would work out this way, and this one, things would normally work out that way. But when they come together, they can't both be normal, so you get these kinds of problems. So the idea that it's got to be, I mean, I don't know if this is the right kind of thing people say, but you can't be crossing the street unless normally you would succeed, you would have succeeded in crossing the street if you know, but something intervened to do it. I also don't know, it's interesting is that whether, to what extent, I would suspect, just speculation, that the most robust examples of that kind would be cases of action, which were done with intentions. And so one has a clearer idea what the normal course of events would be, namely you succeed in doing what you were trying to do. But for all, I mean, there may well be cases which are not intentional at all, but just have to do with physical processes. So maybe, I mean, whether a ball was rolling, was crossing the street when it got hit by the bus, just because it was rolling across, not because somebody was trying to get to the other side. I don't know whether that, what to think about those kinds of cases. But no, I think, right, so some idea of normal versus intervention, I think, is involved in the dispositional idea too. And,
Ask another question. Always concerning the example of the Electoral Fink, I was wondering whether, I mean, the example is constructed in such a way that we know that the wire has the dispositional property of being live, right?
Uh-huh.
But problem is the property is never manifested because of the Electoral Fink.
yeah.
So I was wondering whether the example doesn't tell us, the description of the case doesn't tell us why the wire has the property, the dispositional property of being live. But one might think that that has to do with something that has its internal structure, the way it's made, and which is the same as the way other wires are made, which is similar to the way other wires are made, which are in fact live because there's no Electoral Fink around. So I don't know whether this is the direction that Goodman would take, because he regarded the notion of similarity as problematic, but resemblance as problematic. But I mean, in a sense, the reason why we are willing to say that the wire is live, although it never manifests its property, doesn't that have to do with the fact that the wire has some similarity and resemblance with other live wires?
Yeah, good, yeah. That's the, so if you go back to the idea that to project in the way Goodman had in mind, and the way I'm thinking of it, you're making an empirical hypothesis that there exists a property, and which it's essential that it be in some sense independent of whether it is subjected to the test condition. So you're going to then test your hypothesis that there exists such a property by finding related properties which are manifested in different ways and which tend to correlate with it or something like that. So, and you know, when a lot of people talk about disposition, they talk about finding the categorical base of a disposition, and that's certainly the way Goodman thought about it. He thought we now, once we've identified this property by sort of fixing the reference, we go and find out more about it by perhaps finding other ways to detect whether it's there, other than the one we use to define it, or to fix the reference of it. And so that is partly a matter, I think, of finding similarities between, and in the case with live wires, I mean, you know, we have a theory about what's going on in the wire in the case where it's live. And that theory could be tested in other ways. And so that's, I think you're right to think of it as a kind of similarity between the one with the Electoral Fink attached and the one without the Electoral Fink attached. And so the idea that there's some notion, as Goodman said, of intrinsicness, that is, there's something about, something localizable in the thing itself. And that means if we change the surrounding conditions in lots of ways, it ought to still have it. And do we test for that as well? And that's, again, a matter of finding similarities between things that have the Electoral Fink on them and things that don't. So I think that's right. I think that's the part of the overall strategy of identifying the property and explaining how it's possible for it to have the dispositional property without the counterfactual property.
While other people think about their question, I have a follow-up question on the thing you were discussing. Because now you are saying that concerning dispositional properties, you are looking for intrinsic properties and similarity between intrinsic properties had by similar objects. But I thought that you were discussing and Lewis, because he was assuming intrinsic properties as essential properties, and the similarity relation when he were considering counterfactuals, while, as I understood, you were considering relational properties as essential, and you were not looking for the similarity relation, but you were looking for this projection idea. Now, with the dispositions, you seems to go back to a Lewisian approach, namely intrinsic properties and similarities relations. I wanted you to say something about this.
Good. So it's the question, the distinction between intrinsic properties and relational properties is itself somewhat problematic. In a way, a dispositional property is essentially related to other properties that the things don't necessarily have, but so there's a conceptual connection between being having a disposition to shatter and shattering, but things that don't shatter at all. So the idea is that the shattering involves a relation between the object and the rest of the world that it's behaving in. Something has to happen to it, go through a process. But one is trying to sort of reach back to find an intrinsic property that plays a role in explaining what it does in other situations, how it interacts with other things, or how it relates to other things. David Lewis's intrinsic, purely natural properties it was important for his project that they be defined, not defined, but that their nature be such as to be independent of any of these connections and relations to other things in the world. So you can say, well, in a sense, a dispositional property is like a relational property, and that's essentially connected with, not just contingently, but by its nature, with the way it behaves when it interacts with other things which also have properties. So the explanation for why something shatters is not just fragility, it's also, you know, the hardness of the floor and the laws and the rest of it. So, so pinning down this notion of intrinsicness, I think to try to do it Lewis's way, get these, then you wind up with some kind of mysterious inner core of a property that doesn't connect essentially with anything, and I think that's. But I don't know if I'm getting at what you're.
Yeah. Yes. I think that there is a difference between the way you see the intrinsic properties and what Lewis says is that the intrinsic properties are, namely, properties which are possessed by an object independently of any relation the object has with anything else. So, but when you talk of dispositions and you are saying that there are certain properties which are possessed by an object, and what we are saying that those properties are relational properties, even if they do not manifest themselves. It is not real clear what it is.
Yeah.
I was trying to.
Yeah. Of course, I don't. I don't want to rest anything on a distinction between intrinsic. I mean, I think there's sort of a kind of rough intuitive idea of the property itself as opposed to trying to separate features of the world in a way. We say, well, we want to locate a certain aspect of the explanation for how things are behaving in this complex hurly-burly of reality, interactive processes and so on. We want to locate an explanatory component in each of the things that are involved in this sort of way of thinking of the interaction as the interaction of objects, where objects have an identity of a kind. But I think the task of identifying the intrinsic properties of the object, trying to define what it means for a property to be intrinsic, is not an easy task, and I'm not sure. I mean, it may be one should do it in different ways for different purposes, but so I didn't want to rest anything on that distinction. So is it really intrinsic being fragile? Now, I don't think all dispositions are intrinsic in even the ordinary sense, but you might ask, suppose not only, suppose by law of nature every live wire is connected with an electrofink or something like that. I mean, there's some sort of deep explanation for why these two things have to go together. Would it still be fragile? And you might say, well, that would be a world where the intrinsic properties or would it still be live? The intrinsic properties of the wire remain the same, but deep differences in the rest of the world are different. Does that show that, it's not an intrinsic property of the wire? It's live. I don't think so. I mean, I think if you're Lewis, maybe you want to have these properties that could survive any change in the world other than changing this one thing or something like that. But I'm not sure there's a clear idea of that. So I think the very distinction is one you want to make in a kind of relative way. I mean, just take the dispositional property being observable. Imagine a world where the observing creatures have a radically different perceptual system than we have. Well, and then they can pick up certain things we can't pick up and can't pick up certain things we do. I mean, or even in the world, dogs can perceive things by smell, which human beings can't. Some creatures hear things. Is it really hearing? You know, and all this. So I think a property like observable seems in some way very much defined in terms of what's normal for other things in the environment, and so it's not really an intrinsic property. But beyond the sort of general idea that one wants to kind of locate the part of the task of bringing some order to our theory of the world is trying to locate parts, things, entities with some kind of robust character where it's easy to distinguish, at least given the environment we're in, the properties being really located in the thing in some intuitive sense, and how much that only works because the rest of the world is a certain way. I mean, but so that's the very general task, but it doesn't yield, I think, a really sharp notion of an intrinsic property.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the underlying metaphysics, because I think I got a little bit lost with the role of dispositions in the picture. So,
with the role of
dispositional properties.
Yeah, okay.
So, where does the buck stop in terms of maybe, let's say, what's fundamental or what's primitive? So, we've got talk of counterfactuals, we've got talk of dispositional properties, talk of laws of nature and things like that. And you might think that if you take the laws and plug in how things are, you get dispositional properties being a kind of emergent thing, like just, you know, the microscopic features of a vase plus the laws of nature. From that, you get the fragility of the vase. Mm-hmm. But that's presupposing that we have an account of laws of nature before we get the dispositions. If we're analysing counterfactuals in a kind of Lewisian possible world way, we have the laws, and then we analyse the counterfactuals based on the laws and the things at the worlds. Mm-hmm. Again, dispositions don't enter into the picture there until quite late in the story. But for you, I was thinking dispositions seem to be a bit more primitive than that. Maybe we can use dispositions to analyse the counterfactuals, use dispositions to analyse the laws. But that's where I think I lost the thread. So could you say a little bit more about the place of dispositions in the metaphysics for you?
Good, okay, so yes. So one of the, even whether or not Lewis's reductive project works, I think one still can ask some questions about relative priority here, and which of the kind you're asking. And I think the tendency to take laws as somehow the most basic notion, and first get clear about that. And if you do that in Lewis's way, which is I think the only way to do it if you're going to try to do it first without bringing in the rest of the apparatus, is as purely descriptive patterns of regularity. And then you say, so what are the things that are regular, are regularly conjoined or connected and so on? And I think you say, well, fundamental properties. But not just fundamental properties. I think one starts at all different levels, and with, I mean, often the way one theorizes is to start with relatively superficial observable properties of things in the world, which are clearly dispositional, in a but very kind of vague way, where lots of these sufficiently, you know, appropriate, you know, I mean, words like that being built into your characterization. So I think the things that are involved in both sort of more surface common sense generalizations and laws, and when you get deeper down into the more fundamental theories, you're developing concepts which are essentially dispositional, and in a way more tightly tied to their manifestation conditions than the superficial ones are in some ways. And they say, like a notion like soluble, the test condition is much clear, much more explicit, and but soluble is a theoretical disposition. So I think while you're looking for generalizations, the generalizations which are sort of the analog of laws when you get to the fundamental level, the things you start with are going to be highly defeasible with lots of weasel words built into them, all of the things being equal and under normal conditions and stuff like that. And then you work to make them more precise, and at the very time you're working to make the generalizations more precise, you're also sharpening and clarifying the properties that describe the things that are going to be generalized about. So I think one doesn't want to think of the laws as more sort of separable and prior from the right. The project has to go back and forth between individuating properties and generalizing about those properties. And if you don't find any generalizations of defensible, verifiable kind, then you have reason to doubt that you've succeeded in finding the right properties. Or your predicates maybe don't really mean, don't have a reference. And so it's part of the rejection of the reductionist project of Lewis's kind is a rejection of a sharp hierarchy of order, conceptual order of explanation, and much more holistic kind of back and forth. Does that get at the metaphysical?
Any other question? So we thank you very much for coming, for giving those very useful lectures for us. We really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. And thank you all. And,